What's up RC drifters, and welcome back to another upgrade video on my RMX 2.0. In this episode we move the ESC to the rear using this 3D printed mount and change the position of the servo. The first session of the year at Slide Effects was awesome, but I really struggled to accelerate out of the corners. After a little bit of head scratching, we added some wheel weights to the underside of the rear body mount, and that helped considerably. With that, I knew I had to move my ESC to the rear as my next mod. And whilst we're at it, I want to try the alternate positioning of the servo by placing it vertically. This also helps to push more weight towards the back, as well as balancing the chassis from left to right. So with all that talking done, let's rip this thing apart. So first things first, let's start the teardown. So I'm going to start by removing the ESC. We are going to unplug the motor wires, unplug the sensor cable, unplug the main power and ground, and pull all that out of the way. While we're at it, we might as well just remove the battery, and it is worth noting that although I can just pull off the terminals on my motor, yours might be soldered on, so you'd have to remove your motor at the same time. So with all those wires unplugged and the battery removed, we can see that there is a channel that runs underneath the battery compartment that I've taped over, and that's the main signal wire for the ESC. At this point, you need to pay attention to the orientation of your signal wire for when you reinstall it into your receiver. But yeah, now we're going to just go, right, okay, so that's the brown one on that side, and we're going to remove that tape, take off that sensor wire, and then we'll be able to remove the ESC from underneath where it's housed at the moment. So there's the ESC removed. I'm just going to put that to one side. I'm also going to remove the receiver, as I want to replace that to where the ESC was underneath the motor. Before removing the receiver, I've just put a little purple dot on either end of the wire so I know which orientation it is, and then it's also, I'm going to take a note of what channel the wire goes in. So the gyro wire is in channel 1 and the ESC wire went into channel 2. Next we need to pop off the 3 ball ends on the front hubs either side and remove the complete wheel assemblies. With the front hubs removed, we then want to move on to removing the front shocks. And then the last thing to remove before we flip the chassis over is to remove these 2 Allen head bolts either side, which are 2mm Allens. And then lastly, we want to remove the turnbuckle that connects the steering arms to the servo horn. And now with the chassis flipped over, we need to remove these 2 rear Allen heads for the rear bumper. These 2 Allen heads hold in the servo, which will then turn the servo 90 degrees and attach here and here. And then we need to remove these screws here, these 2 and these 2, which secure the steering and the front bulkhead. And then also, just for ease of access, we need to remove these 3 screws for the front bumper assembly. So with all those screws and the bumpers removed, we can go ahead and install our 3D printed ESC mount. This is just a trial print just to see if it works. If I like it where it is, I'll reprint it again in maybe either red or completely black. And this simply goes in the same place as the rear bumper using the same rear bumper screws. And just like that, the rear valance / ESC mount is installed. Flipping the chassis back over, we're now ready to remove the front bulkhead, which simply just slides out like this. We can put this to one side and now look at the proper orientation of the servo. Originally, you can see this is how the servo is mounted. However, for this new setup, we want to turn the servo 90 degrees so we've got it all facing longitudinal instead of horizontal. So with the servo removed, we can take a closer look. For this particular setup, I'm going to need to remove the servo mounts and flip them around the other way. So the servo is sitting in that position, and then I'll also need to remove the servo horn and flip it 180 degrees so the contact point for the turnbuckle is at the top here. And with that all flipped round, we can go ahead and install it back into the chassis. And now the servo is installed in its new location, we can go ahead and put the chassis to one side and look at the front bulkhead. So with the front bulkhead removed, we need to now look at taking apart the steering rack. You can see here that the pivot point on the steering rack moves in that arc, and we need to separate arms A and B and place them in a different location. So to start off with, we just want to flip that up, and these two Allen heads, we're going to remove them and take the rack away from the bulkhead. With the rack removed from the bulkhead, we can take that to one side and concentrate on working on the rack itself. So next we will take apart these two screws and just remove the housing and the bolts and put that to one side also. And with these two screws out the way, we can remove the rack and arm C and just concentrate on arms A and B. We want to undo these two bolts with our 1.5mm Allen, and what we are going to do is we are going to move this mounting hole down to the 5th mounting hole. So this pivot point will be up here. And just like that, you can see the difference there. Now all there's left to do is reinstall everything. With the rack back installed onto the arms, first of all you want to just do these two up until everything is snug, and then all you're looking to do is just back off quarter of a turn at a time until you've got a nice free movement there. Again with the other one, quarter of a turn, a little bit more, quarter of a turn, smidge more on that one. There we go, nice and free. And then that's ready to install back into the subframe. And then with the rack installed back into the front bulkhead, you follow the same procedures, doing these bolts up as we did with these back ones. Snug everything down until everything is tight, and then back off until it's loose. If you do have the upgraded aluminium part like I do, all you do is tighten these up and you're good to go. And there's nice, no resistance in the rack. It will just flop to one side to the other. And we're ready to install this back onto the chassis. So bringing the chassis back into play, we are simply just going to slot the front subframe back into position and then do up the 4 bolts to either side to secure everything from the top. Next we want to get our trusty 2mm Allen key and drop it in this hole to make sure that everything is nicely aligned. And with the Allen key going straight the way through the rack and into the bottom plate, it holds the rack nice and sturdy so we can make sure that everything is properly aligned. And then next, with the servo in the centered position and the rack fully centered, with the Allen key placed right the way through the rack and the bottom deck, we can measure the distance between the ball end on the servo to the ball end on the rack. The centre to me looks to be 77mm, so we can go ahead and adjust our new turnbuckle to that length. So for our new turnbuckle, we're going to be using this 68mm M3. We'll also need a pair of these 4.8mm medium ball ends. The part number for those is 230067. And then with the turnbuckle and the ends all set to the right length, we can simply just clip this onto the steering rack and the servo. Like so. So with the front end all reinstalled, one last check, make sure we've got equal mechanical lock and the hubs are maxing out either side and there is no issues with clearance or binding, and we are good to move on to reinstalling the rear end and relocating the ESC and the receiver. Moving on to the rear, it's now time for us to look at installing the ESC onto our 3D printed ESC mount on the rear there. Now, I've taken off the fan and it needs to slide in here like this, but there's just not enough room with my rear mount for my shell. So I'm going to remove this rear mount and replace it with a different one so I can have this sat properly. This particular ESC mount is printed so the ESC sits this way. Other ones are so they can be sat like that way or diagonally. This is the first one I'm going to try, and it's about time I changed this mount anyway. So taking this one out of the way. Usually body mounts are mounted on the post holes here. Because of the design of this one, I had to mount these on inner holes over here. So for me to remove this mount, I have to remove the damper stay here. The two main screws to remove the damper stay are here and here. I will also need to pop off the shocks at the top here, and then I can flip this backwards and then get access to the screws on the back of this rod, whereas at the moment there isn't the room from behind here. From this angle here we can see this is the bolt in here that holds my body mount. On this side with my 2mm Allen driver, I would be able to fit this bolt, but the problem is on the other side where the spur gear is, I can't get to that one. From this angle here we can see there is the screw, and it is actually blocked not only by the spur gear but also from the motor plate as well. So yeah, for me personally, I've got to take off the damper stay so I can get to those. But my new body mount will be mounted on the side holes here, so I will have better access and ease of getting that. You can actually see here the wheel weights that I stuck onto the underside of the body mount to add some extra weight to get some better traction on the rear wheels. This is one of the reasons why I'm moving to a rear ESC configuration, so I can eliminate some of these weight and get a better rear to front weight ratio. So with the rear damper stay bolts removed there, I can just move this to one side to gain access to those mounting screws either side, and then remove my rear body mount. And now with the rear body mount removed and the rear damper stay and shocks reinstalled, we can have another trial fit of my ESC and see that it fits nicely into that recess. For now, I'm going to leave the wires the length that they are, although we could nicely shorten them and come up over the top of the damper stay there, and elongate the battery wires down to the battery as well. But for now, because I'm probably going to change these electrics in the future, or I may well change the angle of the ESC mounting, maybe find another mount maybe like this, or in a different configuration. For now, I'm just going to leave the wires as they are, and everything can just get plugged back in, and with a little bit of double-sided tape we can just stick this down here. So with the ESC all stuck down onto the back of the diffuser, I've stuck the capacitor to the back of the ESC. We've got the on-off switch stuck to the side of the fan with the ESC fan reinstalled. All the wires running up over the top of the damper stay, and the motor wires plugged back in. This seemed the best way to route everything. Got the receiver underneath the motor here where the ESC was, with easy access to the main ESC wire to unplug that to be able to plug it into my program box to adjust ESC settings. And I've moved the gyro down to the other side underneath where the ESC was, to kind of keep everything balanced behind the battery. Now the next things to do is to make up some new battery wires. This is the original connectors here and over here. You can see that they are too short now, so I'm going to make up some new wires and a connector from here down to the battery. But before I extend the wires, let's install my new GTRC rear body mount. The body mount itself was really easy to install, with just an M3 screw going through to this main bar, and then an M3 screw and nut holding on the magnet either side. I then raised the magnets using these M3 anodized washers, 2 3mm ones underneath the magnet, and also another 3mm one underneath in between the post and the riser. I did this so we could get the shell sitting at the right height and have a look at wheel clearance. Next, I made up some new power leads to connect the battery, with a Dean's connector on one side and some nice Yeah Racing right angled 4mm bullet connectors on the other side. They've also got little O-rings to easily denote which is the positive and then which is the negative. I then managed to find a 3D print file for the battery covers with a half seat back that simply just press on and get held on by the clips like the original item. And now with everything installed, we're ready to take this bad boy for a rip.